Now, we'll move to an example where an exile functions as an identity foundation, meaning the person's identity becomes organized around the exile as a central part of the structure. The client, let's call him Luca. The purpose is the same as before, to show how the personality is structured, the function of the character defense, and how the defense shapes resistance in therapy. Luca was 25 when he came to therapy. By then, he had already endured several breakdowns. He had dropped out of university twice. His small IT venture had stalled, and most days he stayed in his room at his parents' home, telling me he felt broken beyond repair. An online romance had recently ended with someone he had never actually met in person, but who had been his only source of affection. Even if it was just through online messaging, at least someone had shown interest in him. At first, the person on the other side of the screen found him intriguing, but later they withdrew, after discovering his fetish for being cared for like a baby. That rejection sent him spiraling into a suicidal crisis. The breakup was not only a loss, it confirmed a private verdict he lived under. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, he would be humiliated and abandoned. His everyday life revealed a deeper struggle. He couldn't stay focused on coding for more than a few minutes before sliding into hours of doom scrolling through erotic material. Threads and videos fed a familiar current of masochistic humiliation. He masturbated compulsively to fantasies of degradation. Relief lasted only seconds before shame swelled back in, and the day was gone. Nights bled into mornings. Daily tasks were constantly postponed. Each delay reinforced his conviction that he was incapable. He described time as slipping through my fingers, like there's nothing to hold on to. This is where the losses accumulated. Not only the loss of romance, education, or career momentum, but also the steady erosion of agency, coherence, and faith in his future. Instead of studying, he drafted long complaints against professors he felt were not fulfilling their roles. He could not focus on preparing for exams, because focus itself triggered anger toward the university. In general, he carried strong disdain for any kind of authority. In Reich's terms, Luca carried the classic masochistic organization: outwardly compliant, deferential, eager to please, inwardly resentful, bitter, and almost devoted to seeing himself as a failure. Even his courtesy in session carried two edges. His "I'll do anything to get better" stood alongside a quiet test. No matter what you do, I will not give in. Structurally, Luca's identity rested in an exile. He did not distance himself from this part by saying, "That isn't me." On the contrary, the exile's pain was the ground he stood on. He was the pain, so fused with it that contact often came as a crushing stone in his chest, rather than a clean feeling. From that place, he related to the world. This pain was the very substance of his identity, and because I too became another authority in his eyes, he resisted every intervention. Otherwise, he feared I would become another figure he had to submit to and lose himself in. It seemed that any sign of improvement would mean giving up the pain, and he was far from ready. If I took an active stance, he grew rebellious, intellectualizing, sidetracking, asking suspicious questions about everything I did, even reading my microfacial expressions to figure out what I truly felt toward him and what my agenda was. When I asked why he needed to know, he said he wanted to extract my method, so he could move faster. If I took a passive stance, he complained that therapy was worthless, that I was not helping him, that everything was meaningless, his voice laced with contempt. Sometimes it felt as though he was begging me to save him, while distrusting every movement I made. Therapeutically, this demanded careful pacing. I openly articulated my agenda, and our first step was identifying parts of his personality. The work began with creating just enough space for the exile to be seen. without swallowing him whole. When the exile was witnessed, not solved, not rushed, the ground shifted a millimeter. That millimeter was the difference between being pain and being with pain, and it was the only place from which anything new could start to live. He nicknamed his exile Gollum, a character from The Lord of the Rings, describing it as deranged, tortured, Machiavellian, locked in malicious compliance. Of course, protectors could not be bypassed. Without them, any work with the exile was doomed to fail. The very parts that might have offered structure or containment were perceived as malicious, and pushed behind his identity boundary, turning into enemies. A harsh, mother-like figure, critical, controlling, at times openly sadistic, declared he deserved annihilation. A rigid controller, reminiscent of his father, demanded order and discipline, but stripped of authority could only watch him collapse. Because these protectors were disowned, they were experienced as external persecutors. Professors, bosses, girlfriends, even I, in the therapist's chair. The only part he felt some affinity with was the suspicious protector, scanning for threats, warning him that others would humiliate him. Layered on top of this was a self-like good boy mask that allowed him to blend in. On the identity axis, he rarely left the exile's position. His default sense of self was collapse and defeat, a submissive surface compliance, masking the exile's turmoil. While the exile projected its pain outward, the protectors projected their punitive stance inward. Each part carried its own existential position. The suspicious protectors supplied the rationale. They will humiliate you. It's only a matter of time. The mother protector enforced the sentence. Suffering keeps you in line. If you try anything, I'll destroy you. The controller bargained from the margins. If you could control something, maybe you would survive. The good boy insisted. I must comply. I must do what others want. I also sensed a firefighter protector in the background, though we never fully engaged it. And always there was the exile, clinging tightly, unwilling to let go. For him, unblending felt like dying. It took significant time to establish cooperation, 1 millimeter at a time. He lived in unending turmoil, deranged, tortured, suffocated by worthlessness, failure, and humiliation, trapped in abandonment. At times, he compensated with grandiosity, calling himself a genius held back by injustice. At others, he burned with rage and fantasies of revenge. His structure mirrored his history. His mother's violence lived on in him as a protector that annihilated him whenever he stepped out of line. In context, it made sense. He had grown up in a home with an abusive caregiver, the very person to whom he was most attached, whom he saw as the source of everything, and for whom he cared the most. It was adaptive for the child's psyche to develop a part that predicted danger and demanded submission as a survival strategy. His mother not only abused him, she also enmeshed him. He slept in her bed until puberty. No wonder his development stalled in an infantile position. On the other hand, he despised her, carrying rage and resentment he had to keep hidden. His father was rarely present, and when he was, he often joined the abuse. This type of system is incredibly challenging to work with. That is why I chose Luca's case as a showcase. Many therapists break themselves in situations like this, and that is exactly what the masochistic exile wants, to make the therapist suffer as it once suffered, by making you powerless as he once was, defeating you as he was once defeated, rebelling against you as he never had the chance to rebel, and so on. The work was difficult, but progress was possible. Over time, the annihilating mother began to loosen her grip, and more space opened between Luca and his exile. A long road still lay ahead to build structures that had never had a chance to form. Yet later he managed to enter a serious relationship. move out of his parents' home, and resume his exams. Considering the starting point, this wasn't a minor achievement. Therapists often struggle with clients who are strongly identified with an exile, because everything the therapist does is seen from that perspective. If the therapist wants to offer another perspective, the exile might dismiss it, and even perceive it as a threat to its own existence. If the therapist goes in the direction of exploring vulnerability, it might push the client into a vulnerable position even more, making him even more vulnerable than he was at the beginning. That's why only a careful approach that acknowledges the exile's pain and fear of not being allowed to exist due to the annihilating threat from the internalized mother, which is being projected onto the therapist, and that cooperates with protectors to ease their pressure, can slowly bring the client out of a difficult position. Every other step will lead to endless resistance that will leave the therapist at their direst strains.